a core group, when we looked at the program for this week, we decided as a group, say, well, what we have identified as perhaps the main issue when it comes to Muslims in Europe at this particular moment in time is this whole talk about radicalization. And we didn't want to look at it from a negative perspective, say, well, the fear of it or the downsides of it. I'm sure there are lots of those. But we want to look at it from a possibilities opportunity. What possibilities does these give us for the gospel? Unfortunately, we had to make some last-minute changes in the program because some of our core people couldn't make it. Like Isaac Gatas, who was supposed to speak on dialogue and how dialogue impacts the relationship between dialogue and radicalization. Yasser Irik is a Muslim background believer, supposed to talk about the impact it has for Muslim background believers. Bernard Reisema, same name, different person, was supposed to talk about theology of radicalization. So we missed some of those valuable part of our program, unfortunately. People are people and they make their own choices. They're not here. So we will give you, it's like a menu. This next week will be like a menu. You present different kinds of food, perhaps even different kinds of tastes. Some may not be of your liking. That's fine. I hope you don't get sick of it. But some may be more like what you like, and some may be less what you like. Bear with us, have patience, may God guide us and give us joy and peace. Well, I'm going to start off, and I've already taken up half an hour of my time, but it's important for us to get to know a little bit, so I may have to skip a few things of what I wanted to do. Radicalization of Muslims in Europe, an overview. The speakers, we did not really interact much about the content of what we're going to say, so there may be some overlap, and it's okay. I mean, sometimes we hear things and we need to hear them twice or three times before we are able to grasp what we're talking about. So this morning I would like to give a little bit of an overview when it comes to radicalization in Muslims. I've put everything on paper, so if you're interested afterwards to have a copy of this, let me know. We hear a lot about it in Europe and in newspapers and the media, but we really don't know what it actually means. There's a lot of confusion about it. Also, we don't really know, is it organized? Is someone sitting developing a master plan? Although some Christians seem to believe that, but I don't agree. Also, we don't really know what are the characteristics of radicalization. Until fairly recent, this whole terrorism in the name of Islam was a little bit far away from us. It happens in different parts of the world, but gradually it has become part of Europe. I mean, we have incidents in most of our countries in Europe. In my city of Amsterdam, we had the murder of Theo van Gogh by a radical Moroccan guy. Of course, we had bomb attacks in Spain. We have the underground situation in London. We have the cartoon, although it was not terrorism, but it's certainly some unrest in Denmark. We have several incidents that have taken place. At the moment, there are about 2,000 Muslim young people from Europe that have gone to Syria to fight. About 2,000. So that's a significant group of people. And some of them get killed when they are there, but some of them come back and they cause a lot of problems when they are back. What are they going to do? They are radicalized in their mind and thinking. How are they going to handle? In the Netherlands, when they come back, their passport is taken away. In fact, that will be very hard to come back without your passport, but they have to go somewhere. If they come back to my country, they go somewhere else. In the UK, MI5, that is the British Secret Service, has said they believe there are 2,000 individuals who pose a threat to the national security, and a further 2,000 who are actively plotting but not individually known to the authorities. So about 4,000. And of course, you do only need one to make a mess. I mean, if one of them is actually having a bomb and trying to do something. Since September 11, 2001, there have been 200 terrorist convictions in the UK. In the Netherlands, the Minister of Integration said between 20,000 and 30,000 Muslims are potentially attracted to Salafi ideologies. And 2,500 might be susceptible to violent radicalization, which is about 0.3% of all Muslims in the Netherlands. So it is an issue. We cannot ignore it. It happens. It's there. It's a minority. It's certainly in many countries a very small minority, but nevertheless, it's something we need to keep in mind. I think we need to also differentiate between fundamentalists and radical Muslims. You can be radical we are radical in a certain way, in the way we are in our theology, but doesn't mean we are using arms to make our radicalization known to the rest of the world. So we have to understand and also that conflicts between Europe, society, and Muslims are not only because of terrorism. There are Muslims that are just criminals put into prisons because of crime they did, or because of some other stuff. What is unfortunate is that there is hardly any, well, first of all, there is no connection often between the radical Muslims using violence to accomplish their purposes and other Muslims, although in the mindset of the European society, and also Christians sometimes, we put them into one basket. And we need to differentiate between the two, between fundamentalist Muslims and radical Muslims. So the European Union, the European Commission has given a brief definition of radicalization. The phenomenon of people embracing opinions, views, and ideas which could lead to acts of terrorism. Isaac Khattas, who is not here, but he did put something on paper, which I like to hand out, and you can pass it on if you want. He compares moderate Muslims with radical Muslims, and just pass them around. Take a copy. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I just want to make clear that we need to also as Christians understand there are differences between Muslims and Muslims. So there are moderate Muslims and radical Muslims, and Isaac has given, I think, a very helpful differentiation between the two. Are there enough? I have more here if you want. It's okay? All right. So basically, if you look at the list, he basically says, well, moderates are trying to justify, are more flexible in interpreting the Quran and the Islamic sources than the radicals are. The radicals really are people who want to take literally the Quran and everything it says and make it stick, and they are not very open to ideas that are coming so-called from the West or from the infidels in general. You can compare, and you can look at this list later if you want. I think it's quite helpful to make this kind of distinction. So within the fundamentalists, actually, you can also then differentiate even further between you are Islamists, Salafists, and Jihadis. And one of the books that I read about this is called Angry Muslims, written by Lycan. And you find, I think, in your references you have Robert Lycan, Europe's Angry Muslims, the Revolt of the Second Generation. And in this book he actually differentiates between Muslims, even fundamentalists, and radical Muslims, and he calls Islamists, and he basically says they accept modern society, but they want to change it into a more fundamentalistic direction, mostly through political involvement and preaching. The Salafis, of course, Salafist means righteous predecessors. They look back to the time of the Prophet and his companions, and they want to observe strict how to live a religious life. They want to return to the past, to the golden age of Islam, as they see it, which was only in the time of Muhammad and his followers. They want to purify Islam from cultural influences, both from Islamic cultural influences as well as Westerners. And the jihadis, they want revolt. They really want to exterminate domestic, international enemies of Islam, which actually is their most important obligation. They fight not only in Europe, but also outside, as we will see. And they often want to use violence to really accomplish their goal. And even within the radicalization, you can differentiate even further. And you can speak about half an hour of each of those, but it's an overview. So I just want to go briefly about each of these things. You can actually say there are missionary Islamists, who are like the Tabligh Jamaat. They're sometimes called the Islamic Jehovah's Witnesses, because they are the way they're organized, the way they're activated. They go mobile Quranic schools, door to door, proselytizing, preaching teams. They are quite in the Orthodox. They are very puritanical. They want to imitate the Prophet in what they do. They practice a radical form of Islam, but usually, well, in fact, they say they don't use violence. Although people say sometimes radical Muslims are attracted to this group first, and they feel the group doesn't go far enough, so they leave the group, and then they move on to become radical. Radical meaning using violence. Although this particular group would not, at least the public at least, say they use violence. This was established in the UK in the 1960s, and they're also found in other European countries. They have political Islamists. They want to restore the Islam through politics. To do away with the secular law and replace the secular law with Sharia law. No, they were established in the UK. No, they were created they started in India in 1926. So they came to Europe. And all of those, there are groups that I will explain. There are some of the groups that actually started here, established here, but most of those groups had their roots, whether it's in North Africa or in Asia or other places, Pakistan or whatever. This particular, the previous one, they had their history in India. So political Islamists, and I've listed different groups that are, you can say a lot about each of those, but I don't because of time. But some are, of course, we know the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt, and they started there, but they are offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood in 70 countries around the world, including Muslim countries in Europe. They are overall not using violence. They do want to get involved in politics, and one of the quotes that I have in my notes is actually from Lycan's book. He says, Muslim Brotherhood groups engage in electoral politics, and in that respect they resemble European Christian Democrats of the late 19th century or evangelicals in the United States today, though their politics tend to find a home not on the right but on the left. They have these other groups that I mentioned here. Miligurus, should not be a D there, the D is, and of course that comes from Turkey originally, very big in Germany, but also in other parts of Europe. And those organizations, overall, generally speaking, you can say they are radical, but they are not necessarily violent in trying to accomplish their goals. So I would call them political Islamists. The Arab European League is in Belgium. The Muslim Association of Britain, Mansilar, also found in different parts in Europe. And actually they began in Europe well, they didn't begin in Europe, but they started in Europe in 1973. Then the further group is the Salafi pietists. They're Salafis, but they are, again, they want to peaceful propagation, dawah, it's like invitation to faith, or through education, or to purification. Politics to them is a deviant innovation. They don't get involved in politics. They don't want, in fact, they would isolate themselves as much as any pietist from any religion probably would do. This is a quote from one of the books, actually another book that I used in preparing this. It's a good book too. Let me see where you can find it in your notes, but it's Jihadi Terrorism and Radicalisation Challenge, Ethno-Religious Conflict in Europe. Several of those books make note of this. So the Salafi pietists, neither their verbal violence towards France, they are particularly strong in France, but in other parts of Europe as well, nor their orthodox conception of Islam should be taken as a prelude to an engagement in jihad. On the contrary, this form of religious radicalism and the anti-French tirades of its militants act as a sort of safety valve that diverts the militants from direct action. They're radical, but they are not violent. And in that sense, they are certainly they are like pietists. This may be a good terminology too. And one of the examples of this is the Ahbab movement in France. It's a small movement. Like I said, these groups are not necessarily very big, but they are. I'll talk about the pietist Salafists. For instance, France. There were about 20 cultural centers in France that organized those Salafi things. Every year since 1998, they had a big national convention. They had about 1,000 people coming there. But then the French government decided, well, we should probably get rid of this group, so they forbade the meetings of these people in large groups now. So they are still there, but they don't meet in public, certainly not in large numbers. And the Ahbab movement in France has about 20 centers that they feel they have responsible, or they are part of their network, so to speak. Then you have the jihadi Islamists. And they are militant. They reject man-made electoral politics. They embrace violence. They reject the more soft ideas of, like, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood. They wage wars against external or internal enemies of Islam. But even those groups are also diversified. You cannot say they're all one. And they sometimes differentiate it between using the amount of violence they want to use to one another. Now you have the Islam, of course, and among these groups you have those that are mostly nationalists. They want to set up a caliphate, usually in the countries of origin, not necessarily in Europe, like Hezbollah and some of those other groups. They are created sometimes in the Arab world or wherever they are from, in North Africa, but then they have come to Europe mostly to raise support, money. And sometimes because they have been kicked out of their own countries, so they looked for a safe place to continue their work. But their focus is very often on the countries of origin where they come from, not on Europe. I mean, they still want to overthrow whatever country they are coming from, the governments, and they want to do things there. But their focus is very much outside Europe and not so much inside Europe. They are fighting for justice, what they feel is not being done right now. And you have all these groups there here. Some are actually split of others. Some have actually, they're getting, like actually right now you see in Syria, the radicals are fighting one another sometimes because one according to some, the one is not radical enough. And you see the same thing happening among some of those groups. They are not really getting along well very much together. And then you have more the political religious radicalism of the Al-Qaeda type, so to speak. These guys really want, their focus is on issues like Israel, Palestine, discrimination in Europe. They confront the enemies of Islam around the world. Very anti-imperialism, focusing on the US and everything that is related to the US. Christian focus as well. And they want to annihilate opposition. They want to save Islam, which they feel is under danger. They fight also against other Muslims, of course, because they are not good Muslims. And I've listed some of those groups. And some are actually, the first group mentioned here, Al-Mujahirun, it said that some of the hijackers of 9/11 actually were part of this group in Germany. 3 of the hijackers there were connected to that movement in Germany. But in 2004, this first group split in two, and the second name mentioned there was one of the splits of those first group. The Hofstad group is actually from the Netherlands, young Dutch Muslims, mostly from Moroccan backgrounds, and they try to cause some problems. In fact, the murder of Theo van Gogh was done by a guy related to this Hofstad group. And then you have the Piranha group. It's again from the Netherlands, a Moroccan guy, Samir Azouz. He wanted to plan terrorist attacks in the Netherlands and close connections to others. He was actually 17 years old when he was arrested first time. Then you have the, oh yeah, this is the same thing. Yeah. Okay, so characteristics of those, generally speaking. I mean, I have to, like I said, it's an overview. I can't be too detailed yet. Because there have been quite a few terrorists around, unfortunately, there have been people that have actually studied what made a person into a terrorist, what made him grow into this, what were some of the characteristics, both on a global scale as well as on a Europe scale. Mark Segeman, who actually wrote a book called Understanding Terror Networks, he looked at 172 jihadi terrorists from all over the world. And he says the process of becoming a terrorist went through different stages. First of all, a social affiliation with jihad through friendship, kinship, and discipleship. Then intensification of beliefs, actually accepting the Salafi theology, and then acceptance of jihad. So it's first of all, they become connected to people, that they have this, are more radical ideas. Then they become more theologically speaking radical. And then the next step is they actually are going to use violence in order to accomplish what they believe is necessary to be done. Not all are from deprived backgrounds. Sometimes people say, well, if you're radical Muslims, usually come from those that have been socially isolated or deprived. That's not the case. In fact, you have very well, high educated people, Muslims, that have become terrorists. So it's not necessarily a given. Segeman, for instance, found that most, generally speaking, terrorists that he researched were middle-class, educated young men from caring and religious families who grew up with strong, positive values of religion, spirituality, and concern for their communities. Some actually were married and had children. But a few, that's quite interesting, a few were employed full-time at the time they joined jihad. So, although they were well educated, there was something, a part of a crisis in their life, which happened just prior, because the radicalization actually can take, this process can actually take a few months. It doesn't take 3 years. I mean, I've heard stories in the Netherlands, for instance, of fathers who say, I've seen my son change from a nice guy to a radical guy who's off to Syria. I don't know, I will never see him back in 3 months' time. So it doesn't have to take long. But in the Netherlands, or in Europe, Edwin Baker, who's also looked at the European terrorists, Muslim terrorists, he found that most of them came from North Africa. Mostly second and third generation immigrants. Very high, 25% had a criminal record, so they were criminals before they became radical Muslims. And mostly were single men, and the average age was 27. 27. I thought, well, I was always in the impression it was a lot younger. What they have in common, all of them somehow is alienated and in search of identity. Just before they joined the jihad, they were socially and spiritually alienated and in some form of distress. For instance, the guy who murdered Theo van Gogh in Amsterdam. His mother died. And that had triggered in his life. I mean, I had a lady working in my office. She's a Muslim, and she was a neighbor of the guy. So she said, I've seen him change. In a few weeks' time, when his mother died, he became isolated. He didn't want to go to the mosque anymore. He looked for the internet, and he became so under the influence of radical Muslims. He started reading letters, writing letters in a matter of a few months. So the trigger there in his life was the death of his mother. So it was a crisis somehow in his life. Mostly not related to mosques. It's not that there's a mosque somewhere saying, well, there are mosques in some places of Europe where they are very radical, actually are stimulating this, but mostly they are not. And most of the Muslim terrorists or radical Muslims in Europe are not associated, at that moment when they became radical, at least in the way of using violence, when connected to a mosque. In fact, the mosques really don't know how to handle them sometimes, and they need help, and they ask for help. A very high percentage of converts, those that have converted to Islam. Again, very interesting. It's estimated that from Al-Qaeda, for instance, in Al-Qaeda networks around the world, between 9 and 20% are Muslim converts. Those that have not grown up as a Muslim, that became a Muslim somehow in their life. What is very significant, they are often related to one another through kinship or friendship. There is something going on. There's a social thing. It's usually they are going with groups or they are influenced through groups, through kinship, friendship types of relationships. Quite interesting. Homegrown means they actually did, according to Baker, who did research in Europe, more than 40% of Muslim terrorists in Europe are born in Europe. And 55% raised in European countries or long-term Europeans. So homegrown is really a term we can actually use. Future, hard to tell. People say because of all of this, it all much depends on how the government, how society responds to Islam, that actually will decide whether this group is going to grow rapidly in the next years or so. I attended a conference some months ago, organized by two of my Muslim friends, talking about radicalization of Muslims in Amsterdam. And they had a panel of people, 6 people, all Moroccans. One was a convert, a Salafi convert. He changed his name, and he really was promoting this really violent type of Islam, and the rest was trying to keep him quiet. But it was quite interesting to see how many young people that were in the room were very sympathetic to the Muslim convert, and I was a little bit frustrated with that. But and even one of the speakers that we invited for this conference had to come with a bodyguard. He was a Moroccan imam, one of the leaders in the Netherlands when it comes to Christian-Muslim relations and Muslim government relationships. He had to come with a bodyguard because he was threatened by other Muslims because of what they saw as a too soft approach. So it's hard to tell what the future will be like. I'm not a prophet, but it is not unlikely that we will have this kind of a violent Islam with us for the next years or so. Like I said, it's a very small minority right now, and I think it will remain that. But it is something that Muslims are concerned about themselves. There are lots of conferences going around in Europe, organized by Muslims, to deal with this, because they believe they have a problem to solve somehow, and they do have a problem to solve society. I want to finish, and I'll have more time for questions in a minute. How can we respond to some of this? Well, there are different ways, but I'll just list a few. Let Muslims interpret the Quran. I think we have to be careful that we are doing it for them. Radical Muslims interpret the Quran and take certain verses out of its context, at least that's what other Muslims tell me. And so we have to be careful. Let Muslims deal with that, and let we try to stick to our book, to our Bible. We don't like Muslims to tell us what the Bible means, and I think we should be careful not to tell them what the Quran means. There are political issues that are at the background of some of the radicalization that is taking place. We have to deal with that. I mean, we cannot, some of the anger that is causing some of the Muslims to become violent, the anger is based on injustices that are real. We cannot deny this. I mean, there are some things that have happened in Europe or in the world that we cannot just say, well, yeah, you're not right. They are right. I mean, we don't agree with the solution, obviously, but we have to really deal with some of those reasons for their anger. So modern Muslims, we need to help them as much as we can. And sometimes they feel they are not given enough space. Media doesn't often give them enough platform. I've had Muslims say to me, well, Bert, please help me, come with, or let me come with you to certain places that you speak or teach. Because I want to show a different picture of what I think Islam is like, and your friends seem to be having just a one-sided picture. We need to help some of those people. There are moderate Muslims, in fact, a far majority of those. Find a middle path between demonization of Islam and naive political correctness. Of course, we can fall at both ends of the cliff. Because there are things we need to deal with. There are Muslims in our midst, in Europe, that are violent, they are bent on violence, they do everything they can to disrupt society, and we cannot just stand by and do nothing. I mean, our governments have to do something, and we can help them in doing so. We recognize we can maybe play a role in peacemakers. That should be our thing, isn't it? We are a peacemaking group of people, at least in theory we are. And some of the struggle that Muslims are facing is with this secularized society that we are living in. Last week I was speaking to a Muslim friend in Brussels, and we talked about the public space. He said, he said public space is not neutral, but it seems like Christians have given up on using the public space, and we are trying to come to public space, and that's an area where we can help each other perhaps, and how to be religious in a public space. Disassociate ourselves from Christian Zionism. I know it's a bit of a tricky thing, but sometimes we are, as Christians, seem to be agreeing and supporting everything Israel is doing, and we seem to have blinders on when something happens in the name of when Israel does something, we call it defending themselves. When the Palestinians do something, we say, well, they are terrorists. We have to be careful there. But again, that's a sensitive issue, particularly in my country, where Christians are very supportive of everything that Israel is doing. Prepare to hard talk with Muslims and Islamists. There are some difficult questions we need to deal with, and we cannot just ignore them. And of course, throughout the world, we will see this violence coming up, whether it's in Nigeria or whether it's in Central African Republic, although their Christian militias are also fighting. Whether it's in Sudan, we turn around and there's a new conflict starting, and somewhere we hear along the line Muslims were involved. So we need to be able to address those questions with our Muslim friends, and ultimately we need to reach out to them out of respect and love, and not out of fear. And I find, yes, I do come across very radical Muslims sometimes in the way they speak and the way I had a discussion some time ago with a guy, and he said, well, we believe in theocracy, God's rule on earth. I said, I believe in that with all my heart, that God will rule on earth. But I'm not going to need, God doesn't need my help. And he thinks God needs his help to actually make it happen. And I said, that's where we differ from each other. But this guy, interesting with this conference we had about radicalization among Muslims in the Netherlands, the chairman of the meeting, we had 5 more minutes. He said, let me give all of you, in a democratic way, give you 1 minute to speak. In a democratic way. There was one guy at the end, he came to him and I was standing next to him. He said, why did you have to say in a democratic way 1 minute? And the speaker said, well, what should I say then? Islamic way 1 minute? It's the same minute, isn't it? It's still 60 seconds. And he was so upset about the use of democracy. So to him, democracy is of the devil and he needs to fight everything against it. And this is a young guy of 20 years old who has grown up in the Netherlands. So these kind of people we have around us. And we need to, we cannot ignore it. But at the same